My mother told me, "Don't come back home." I spent Thanksgiving by myself, and the strangers at the nearby table became my true family. 5 years later, they were introduced at my wedding as the parents of the bride. Can you imagine being told by your own mother, just days before Thanksgiving, that you're not welcome home? Not because of some huge fight, but because your sister, her golden child, simply doesn't want drama. That single phone call, those 7 cold words, shattered 27 years of my life and kick-started a journey I never saw coming. My name is Tori and I'm 32 now. But this story, this turning point, happened when I was 27. Looking back, it feels like my life has been split in two. The first half, where I desperately tried to earn a place in a family that treated me like a constant inconvenience. And the second half, the one where I finally stopped begging for love. You know, people often think heartbreak is this huge, dramatic moment, a shouting match, a slammed door, a definitive last straw. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just 7 calmly delivered words from your mother that land like a final verdict. Don't come home this year. Victoria doesn't want drama. No explanation. No apology. Not even a pause long enough to pretend she cared what those words would do to me. Just a clean, cold decision that seemed to erase 27 years of me trying to belong. I remember exactly where I was. Because when something truly changes your life, the details tattoo themselves onto your soul. It was November 21st, late afternoon, already dark in that early, dreary way Boston gets, where even the streetlights look tired. I was in my tiny studio apartment, the kind where your kitchen is basically a strip of counter and your bed is always in view. My suitcase lay open on the bed, half-packed. I kept moving the same sweaters from one side to the other, as if I could rearrange my feelings into something manageable. A pumpkin candle, the cheap kind that smells like cinnamon and sugar and wishful thinking, burned on the windowsill. I lit it because I wanted the air to smell like comfort, like home, like everything I kept pretending my family could be. My plane ticket to Connecticut was already tucked into my wallet. Non-refundable, of course. I'd even bought those tiny travel-sized toiletries, because I was the kind of person who still prepared for people who didn't prepare for me. When my phone lit up with Mom, I actually smiled before I answered. That's the humiliating part, isn't it? The way hope survives, even when it's been punished for years. I picked up, practically chirping. "Hey, Mom, I was just about to." She cut me off so quickly it felt like a hand clapped over my mouth. "Tori," her voice was flat, hard. "I need to tell you something." My stomach dropped. That tone never meant good news. My brain, already running through emergencies, asked, "Is Dad okay?" Because it couldn't comprehend what she was actually doing. "Your father's fine," she said. And then there was this pause, like she was arranging her words the way you arrange furniture you don't want to look at too closely. "Listen, I've been thinking, and don't come home this year." At first I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because disbelief can sound exactly like laughter when your mind is scrambling to protect you from utter humiliation. "What do you mean?" I asked, and I could hear the raw, childish confusion in my own voice. The part of me that still believed I had a mother who would catch herself and say, "Of course I want you here, sweetheart." Instead, she just repeated, "Victoria doesn't want drama. She's pregnant again, and she doesn't need the stress." I gripped the phone tighter. Drama? What drama? I hadn't talked to Victoria in months. I hadn't texted. I hadn't called. I hadn't asked anything from her. I'd been quiet, which is what they always wanted. That's when my mom's voice sharpened. "Exactly. And let's keep it that way. You know how you get." "How I get?" My throat tightened so fast it startled me. "Mom, I literally asked her last year why I wasn't invited to her baby shower." "That's not drama. That's a question." My mother scoffed, like I'd just proven her point. "See, that's exactly what I mean. You always make everything about you." I stood there, frozen, staring out the window at a sky that looked like wet concrete. 27 years old. And my mother was telling me I couldn't come to Thanksgiving because I once asked why my sister excluded me. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I already bought my ticket. Then get a refund. Victoria is pregnant. She doesn't need stress. You understand?" And then, just like that, she hung up. The line went dead so cleanly, it was almost impressive. I stared at my phone, the way you stare at something that has utterly betrayed you. I listened to the radiator click and hiss, that metallic, tired sound that always came right before the heat, like the building was promising comfort but never quite delivering enough. I watched the candle flame wobble, bright and stubborn in a window full of dark. And something in my chest, it didn't explode. It didn't even crack. It just went quiet, like the last small part of me that kept hoping finally sat down and refused to stand again. I sank onto the edge of my bed, that useless plane ticket still in my wallet. Memories flooded in. Not like a neat montage, but like the same heavy blanket dropping back onto me. Familiar. Practiced. My 16th birthday. I'd planned it for months. Nothing extravagant, just bowling and cake with 3 friends. But it mattered to me. It was supposed to be mine. My mom promised. In that casual way she made promises she didn't plan to keep, that we'd go, and it would be fun, and I could finally feel like a normal teenage girl. The morning of my birthday, Victoria called, crying, because she'd failed her calculus final and needed emotional support. My mom canceled my party without even looking me in the eye. We spent the day consoling my sister while my friends texted, asking what time to meet, and I typed out lie after lie until I just stopped answering. When I cried, my mom told me, "Don't be dramatic, Tori. Your sister needs us more right now. You can celebrate next weekend." We never did. There was my senior year art show, too. My piece, a charcoal portrait I'd worked on for weeks, hands smudged black, eraser crumbs everywhere, my fingers aching, got picked to hang in the front hall of the school. My teacher told me, "You have real talent," in that encouraging voice adults use when they think you might not hear it often. I invited my parents. My mom said she'd try. That night, I stood by my frame drawing with a plastic cup of punch going warm in my hands, while other kids' parents took pictures, hugged them, told them they were proud. My parents never came. When I called later, my mom said Victoria had a headache and needed her. As if that explained everything. Then college graduation. 4 years of late-night studying, part-time jobs, cheap ramen, praying my car would start, promising myself that once I graduated, maybe they'd finally see me. I graduated with honors, the first in my family. I remember standing in my cap and gown, heart pounding, scanning the crowd for their faces. Their seats were empty. They showed up 2 hours late, casually, like they were arriving at a movie they didn't mind missing the beginning of. Victoria had a routine prenatal checkup. They said that couldn't be rescheduled. My mother squeezed my arm and said, "You understand, sweetheart. Your sister's baby is more important than a ceremony. More important than me," is what she meant. That was always what she meant. I learned early that complaining only made things worse. If I cried, I was sensitive. If I asked why, I was making everything about myself. If I tried to explain how it felt, I was starting drama. So I adapted. I became smaller, quieter, easier. I learned how to swallow the sharp words that rose in my throat. I learned how to smile at my sister's announcements, while my own milestones sat unnoticed. I learned how to be the kind of daughter who didn't require anything because requiring something meant being punished for it. And sitting there at 27, in a cold apartment with a ticket I couldn't refund and a candle that smelled like a holiday I wasn't allowed to have, I finally realized the truth. There was no amount of small that would ever be small enough to earn them. I called my father anyway, because the little girl in me still believed, maybe, just maybe, he would choose me if I gave him the chance. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Hey, kiddo," he said, cautious, like he already knew what I was going to ask and wanted to keep his hands clean. "Did Mom tell you?" I asked. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear the TV in the background. Football, probably. The steady roar of a crowd that sounded like a life happening without me. "She mentioned it," he said. "And you're okay with this?" I asked. "You don't think I should be allowed a Thanksgiving with my own family?" Another pause, even longer. "You know how your mother is," he said. "She's just trying to keep the peace." "By excluding me," I said, and my voice cracked even though I tried to keep it steady. "Then what is it like, Dad? Tell me. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're choosing Victoria over me." Again, silence. I could almost see him in his recliner, rubbing his forehead the way he did when he wanted to disappear from conflict. I asked very softly, "Do you want me there?" And the pause that followed was the loudest thing he'd ever said to me. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I think it's better if you listen to your mother this year." Something inside me emptied out so cleanly it scared me. Not sadness, not rage, just absence. I said, "Okay." He started to say, "Tori, don't be like," and I cut him off. "Okay." I hung up. He didn't call back. Not that night, not the next day. Not ever to say, "I'm sorry," or "This isn't right," or "Come anyway. I'll handle it." As the sun went down and the shadows stretched across my studio floor, I realized my father had been given 1,000 chances to choose me, and he had chosen silence every single time. He liked to believe he was neutral, stuck in the middle, the peacemaker. But neutrality is a choice, too. And he always chose to stand on their side. That night, in the quiet, another decision settled in. Small but solid. If I wasn't welcome at their table, I would make my own. Not immediately, not in some triumphant, fireworks display way. Just in the simplest way possible. I would stop chasing them as if my life depended on their approval, because it was starting to feel like my life depended on me letting go. Thanksgiving Day arrived, gray and cold. I woke up to the sound of my neighbors' family arriving. Children laughing, footsteps overhead, the muffled warmth of voices I couldn't make out. Through the vents came the smell of stuffing and roasted turkey and butter, like the building itself was hosting a dinner I wasn't invited to. I made instant coffee that tasted burnt no matter how much creamer I added. I sat by the window and watched snowflakes drift down onto an empty street that looked like it had been abandoned for the holiday. My phone stayed silent. No calls, no texts, not even a perfunctory Happy Thanksgiving from anyone in my family. Around noon, I made the mistake of opening Instagram. And there it was, Victoria's photo. My parents, my sister, her husband, their toddler in a tiny turkey sweater, all smiling around a dining table in Connecticut like they were starring in an ad for gratitude. The caption said, "So grateful for my family. These are the people who matter most." I zoomed in and counted the place settings. There were 5 chairs. 5. No extra chair. No empty plate. Not even the smallest hint that I was missing. They hadn't just excluded me. They'd erased me. I stared at the ceiling and considered ordering delivery and staying in bed. That's what they expected from me, I realized. For me to collapse into sadness so they could point and say, "See? Drama." But something in me refused. Not out of spite, but out of survival. I put on my coat, shoved my hands into my pockets like I could hold myself together, and decided that if I was going to eat alone, I would do it somewhere with real food and light and the sound of life. Harborview Grill was one of those old Boston restaurants that looks like it's been there forever. Dark wood, brass fixtures, candles on every table, cloth napkins folded into crisp triangles like someone cared about presentation. More importantly, it was one of the few places open on Thanksgiving. When I pushed through the door, warmth hit me like a wave. Roasted turkey, fresh bread, cinnamon, coffee, the soft clink of glasses, the low hum of voices, and everywhere, people who belonged somewhere. Couples leaning close, grandparents laughing with mouths open, children with cheeks flushed from running between tables. The hostess asked, "Just one tonight?" with barely concealed pity, and I forced my face into something neutral and said, "Just one." She led me to a tiny 2-top in the corner, squeezed between the kitchen door and a large family that had pushed 3 tables together. I could have touched their chairs if I reached out. The family beside me had everything I'd wanted without seeming to try. An older couple at the head of the table, late 60s maybe, hands moving like they'd spent a lifetime passing plates to people they loved. A middle-aged man with his wife and 2 kids. A younger man, around 30, who kept making everyone laugh. 3 generations, easy, like love was the default setting. They interrupted each other affectionately. They passed food without asking. They argued about football with the comfort of people who knew the argument would end in dessert and hugs. I tried not to stare, but it was like watching someone else breathe oxygen while you're underwater. The server brought a bread basket and a tight smile. "The Thanksgiving special?" I said yes. My turkey arrived, golden skin, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, stuffing, gravy. Perfect. Magazine perfect. I couldn't taste any of it. I pushed food around my plate, trying not to look at the family next to me, trying not to picture my own family laughing in Connecticut, passing the gravy, not once wondering where I was. And then, in the middle of that restaurant, full of warmth and cheer, A truth I'd been avoiding for 27 years landed in me with complete, shattering clarity. This wasn't about Thanksgiving. It wasn't about Victoria's pregnancy. It wasn't about peace. It was a pattern, so deep it had shaped my entire life. I had spent my whole life trying to earn a place at their table, bending myself into smaller shapes, swallowing my hurt, apologizing for having feelings, and it had gotten me exactly here, alone in a corner with a meal I couldn't taste, and an Instagram photo with no empty chair. The tears came before I could stop them. I turned toward the window, pressed my napkin to my eyes, tried to be invisible the way I always had. "Honey!" A woman's voice, warm, concerned. I froze, then looked up. The older woman from the family beside me stood by my table. Silver hair, kind eyes, a face that looked like it had spent a lifetime actually listening. She looked at me like I mattered. I did what I always did. "I'm fine," I mumbled. "Just allergies." She raised one eyebrow, not judging, just knowing. Allergies don't usually make people cry into their napkin on Thanksgiving. A sound came out of me that was half laugh, half sob. "That obvious, huh?" "Only to someone who's paying attention," she said. "I'm Eleanor." I told her my name. "Tori." And she repeated it, like it was worth remembering. She glanced back at her table, then at me and said simply, "No one should eat alone on this day. Why don't you come join us?" I shook my head immediately. Saying yes felt like stepping into the unknown without armor. "Oh no, I couldn't. I don't want to intrude." Her smile was gentle but firm. "You're not intruding. I'm inviting. There's a difference." Then she continued, like she'd already decided, cracking a joke about her husband's terrible humor and her son trying to start political debates. And from the big table, her husband waved and called, "She won't take no for an answer, trust me. 43 years, and I've never won an argument." The younger man grinned. "He's not wrong." I looked at my cold turkey and my empty table, then back at Eleanor's eyes. And something in me, something that had been starving, leaned toward her warmth. "Okay," I heard myself say. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," she said, and put a hand on my shoulder like it belonged there. "Come on, we just opened another bottle of wine, and there's way too much pie." They made room for me, like I'd always been there. A chair appeared. A plate was handed to me. Before I could even sit down, someone poured wine into a glass and placed a warm roll on my plate. The older man stood and shook my hand firmly. "I'm Richard," he said. "This is my wife, Eleanor. Our son Daniel and his wife Sarah, their kids, Emma and Lucas, and our youngest Marcus." I gave an awkward wave and said thank you too many times. Daniel asked what I did, passing mashed potatoes as if this was normal, as if I belonged at this table. I told them I was a freelance graphic designer. Sarah smiled and said it was wonderful. Emma, who looked about 8, proudly announced she could draw stick figures better than her mom. Everyone laughed. Not at anyone, but with each other. It hit me how different that felt, how laughter could feel like warmth instead of a weapon. Marcus caught my eye from across the table and said conspiratorially, "Fair warning, my dad's about to tell a joke." Richard protested. "Eleanor said, he is." Richard delivered a turkey joke so bad, Daniel groaned, and the kids squealed. Sarah rolled her eyes the way people do when they've heard the joke 100 times and love the person anyway. And I laughed. A real laugh. The first of the day. Richard raised his glass. A toast to unexpected guests who make our table complete. They all lifted their glasses, and I did, too. And warmth spread through my chest like my body was remembering something it had forgotten, what it felt like to be welcomed. Later, when the dinner softened into that slow ending where the coffee comes out, and the kids get sleepy, and the arguments turn into teasing, Eleanor slid into the chair beside me and asked quietly, "How are you doing?" Not the polite version, but the real one. I tried to give her the easy answer. I tried to say I was fine. She took a sip of wine and said gently, "But that's not what I asked." Something about her steadiness made honesty feel safer than performance. I told her about the phone call, about being labeled drama for asking why I was excluded, about how my family always chose Victoria. Eleanor listened without interrupting, the way people who truly listen do. They don't rush you toward comfort. When I finished, she told me she'd spent 30 years in family law, retired now. She'd seen every kind of dysfunction a family could manufacture. And she'd learned that the people who accuse you of causing drama are often the ones creating it. They just need someone to blame. Then she put her hand over mine and said clearly, firmly like a verdict, "You're not the problem, Tori. You never were." I couldn't speak. It felt like someone had finally named the truth out loud after decades of me choking on it alone. When the check came, I reached for my wallet out of reflex, but Richard waved me off like the idea offended him. "Our treat," he said. "Consider it a Thanksgiving tradition." In the lobby, as we bundled into coats and the snow fell harder outside the windows, Eleanor pressed a cream-colored card into my hand with her name and number and address in Brookline. "If you ever need to talk," she said, "call me." "I mean it," Richard added casually. "Sunday dinners every week at our place. You're welcome anytime." Marcus nodded like it was obvious I should come. I walked out into the snow, holding that card like it was something fragile and impossible. And for the first time that day, the cold air didn't feel like punishment. It just felt like weather. I went back to my apartment that night and set Eleanor's card on the little counter space that served as my kitchen, right next to a stack of unopened mail and a cereal box I kept pretending was a pantry. The apartment was still quiet, still small, still mine in that lonely way. But the quiet felt different. It wasn't the hush of being unwanted. It was the hush of something waiting. I kept picking up the card and putting it back down, like it might disappear if I looked at it too long. Eleanor Morrison, Brookline, a phone number written in crisp black ink, as if her certainty could be printed and passed from hand to hand. I slept badly because I was still grieving. But for the first time in years, I also felt a strange flicker of safety, like someone had lit a porch light in a neighborhood I didn't know I was allowed to enter. The next Sunday I didn't go. I told myself I was being respectful, not imposing, not taking advantage of a holiday kindness that was probably meant to be a one-time rescue. The Sunday after that, I didn't go either. I kept imagining the scene, me walking into a house full of family noise like a stray dog that wandered into the wrong yard. I picture myself knocking, Eleanor opening the door, and then realizing she'd been too generous, that she didn't actually want me there when it wasn't Thanksgiving and the world wasn't softened by holiday spirit. Trauma makes you invent endings before anything even begins. Because disappointment feels easier when you can prepare for it. But Eleanor called midweek. Not to pressure me, not to guilt me, just to ask how I was doing. She asked questions the way people do when they actually want the answers. And when I tried to deflect, she didn't scold me. She just waited, calm and patient, as if she wasn't afraid of my silence. By early December, I finally accepted. Not because I felt brave, but because Eleanor's sheer consistency was wearing down the part of me that expected the ground to give out under kindness. That Sunday, I stood on the Morrison porch in Brookline for 5 full minutes before I knocked, my heart thudding like I was about to walk into a job interview I hadn't prepared for. The house was exactly what I'd pictured after Thanksgiving, a beautiful Victorian with a wraparound porch and warm lights in every window. It looked like the kind of place where good things happened without asking permission. I could smell dinner from the porch, something roasted, something buttery, and it made my throat tighten because the scent felt like a promise. Eleanor opened the door before I could change my mind. "There you are," she said, and she pulled me into a hug so natural it almost knocked the air out of my lungs. Not a polite hug, not a stiff one. A mother hug, the kind that says you don't have to explain why you're here. "We saved you a seat," she added, as if that was the simplest thing in the world. And I stood there in her hallway, with my coat still on and my hands still cold, realizing I didn't know how to behave in a place where I wasn't being evaluated. The Morrison home was loud, not with tension, but with life. The kitchen was full of motion, pots clinking, the oven door opening and closing. Someone rinsing dishes while someone else argued about seasoning. Richard stood at the counter, tasting gravy like it was his sacred duty, spoon in hand, brow furrowed in exaggerated seriousness. Daniel and Sarah moved around each other with the practiced rhythm of people who'd cooked 1,000 meals together without turning it into a battle. Emma and Lucas ran through the hallway in sock feet, laughing, and I flinched automatically, waiting for the sharp stop that had always followed joy in my childhood home. But instead, Sarah called, "Careful near the stairs," in a voice that sounded like concern, not irritation. There was a difference. It took me a moment to understand what it was, and when I did, my eyes burned. Eleanor handed me a spoon and pointed me toward a pot on the stove. "Can you stir this for me?" she asked, as if I belonged in her kitchen. That tiny request almost undid me. Being needed in a small, normal way, without it being a test, without it being conditional, felt profoundly unfamiliar. I stirred, watching steam rise, trying to focus on the simple task so I wouldn't cry in the middle of their kitchen. Marcus walked in behind me, took my coat gently without making a big deal of it, and said, "Hey, glad you came." It was such a simple sentence, but my chest tightened because no one in my family ever said they were glad I came. They said, "You're here," like it was an observation, or finally, like it was a complaint. Marcus said glad, like presence was something to celebrate. At the dinner table, Eleanor didn't ask me where I wanted to sit. She pointed to a chair and said, "Here," like the seat was mine. I sat down carefully, like if I moved too quickly, I might break something. Emma slid a napkin toward me and asked if I liked cornbread. Lucas wanted to show me a card trick he'd learned. Richard asked me if I'd ever played chess. Daniel asked about my work again, and when I explained a recent design project, he listened like it mattered instead of nodding politely until he could talk about himself. I realized I was holding my breath, literally holding it, waiting for the moment someone would get tired of me. When it didn't come, my body didn't know what to do with the relief. That first Sunday, I drove home with my cheeks aching from smiling. Not because I'd forced it, but because my face hadn't practiced it in a long, long time. I sat in my car outside my building for a few minutes after parking, hands still on the steering wheel, just absorbing the fact that I'd been inside a house full of family and no one had made me feel like I was borrowing air. I didn't know then that I was at the beginning of a new life. I only knew that for a few hours, I'd felt normal in a way I'd never felt with my own blood. Over the next weeks, Sunday dinners became a rhythm. At first, I went every other week, then more often, until it stopped feeling like a special invitation and started feeling like a place I could count on. The first time I arrived and Eleanor was wearing an apron dusted with flour, she pointed at me and said, "Good you're here. Taste this," and shoved a spoon toward my mouth before I could even say hello. I tasted soup and said it was good, and Richard protested loudly that she always made the best soup anyway, and they bickered with the comfortable ease of people who didn't fear each other's moods. I watched them the way you watch a foreign language being spoken fluently, trying to figure out how they made it look so easy. Richard did teach me chess, and I lost constantly. He made a show of groaning dramatically when I made a move that surprised him, and the first time I actually beat him, months later, he stood up, slapped his hands on the table, and announced, "Well, that's it, folks. I've been dethroned." Marcus pretended to bow in my direction. Emma and Lucas cheered like I'd won the Super Bowl. I sat there, laughing, stunned, because winning wasn't dangerous. Here, in my childhood house, winning somehow always made Victoria feel threatened, and then I'd be accused of showing off, and then I'd apologize for being good at something. At the Morrison table, winning was celebrated like it belonged to all of us. Eleanor showed me her pie crust recipe one Sunday when it was snowing, so hard the street looked like it had vanished. She didn't hand me a card or a printed sheet. She pulled butter from the fridge and said, "Watch." She talked about texture and cold hands and the exact moment dough goes from crumbly to cohesive. She taught me to trust my instincts, to stop overworking, to stop punishing myself for not being perfect the first time. My first crust came out lopsided and cracked at the edge, and I apologized automatically. Eleanor took the crust, looked at it, nodded once and said, "It's homemade." That's the point. And then she kissed my forehead like I was a child and said, "No apologizing in my kitchen for trying." I went to the bathroom and cried silently into a towel because I didn't want to freak them out. And then I came back out and helped her slice apples like my eyes weren't swollen. Somewhere along the way, Daniel and Sarah's kids started calling me Aunt Tori without anyone telling them to. It happened the way real family names happen, organically, without ceremony. One Sunday, Lucas ran into the kitchen and shouted, "Aunt Tori, look," and held up a drawing he'd made of a dinosaur wearing a crown. I froze with a dish towel in my hand, and Eleanor glanced at me like she was checking to see if I was okay. I swallowed hard and smiled at Lucas and said, "That dinosaur is very regal." Lucas beamed like I'd given him a medal. That night in my car, I whispered "Aunt Tori" out loud just to hear it again, just to see how it felt in the air. It felt like a door opening. Marcus and I became friends in the kind of quiet way that changes your nervous system. We didn't have one dramatic bonding moment. It was smaller than that. It was him texting me a photo of a ridiculous building detail he'd spotted on his walk, with a caption like, "Tell me this isn't the ugliest window you've ever seen." It was him saving me a seat next to him at the table without making it obvious. It was him noticing when I got quiet and saying, "Want to take a walk?" Like he understood that sometimes a room full of love can still trigger grief. We'd walk around Brookline after dinner, hands in our pockets, breathing cold air. And he'd tell me stories about his day, about architecture clients who wanted impossible things, about his dad's relentless dad jokes, about how his mom used to be a shark in court but turned soft at home. I'd tell him about design clients who thought a quick change meant my time didn't matter. We'd complain, we'd laugh, and he never once treated my feelings like they were inconvenient. My biological family stayed silent. No Christmas card, no Happy New Year, no message on my birthday. At first, I kept checking my phone, like a reflex I couldn't stop. Like maybe this would be the moment they realized they'd gone too far. Then I stopped checking. The strangest thing about being loved properly is that it changes what you're willing to tolerate. The more the Morrisons showed me that I wasn't hard to love, the less I could accept the lie that I was. I didn't even notice when the silence from my parents stopped hurting every day. It was still there, like an old scar. It just wasn't bleeding anymore. One spring afternoon, about 8 months after that first Thanksgiving, Eleanor and I sat on her back porch while tulips pushed up through the soil and the trees started to bud. Richard and Marcus were inside, watching a game, shouting at the TV. Eleanor sipped tea and asked gently, "Have you heard from your parents?" I said, "No." I hadn't reached out either. She asked if I wanted to. I thought about it honestly. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I imagined calling my mother and trying to explain everything. How it felt to be erased, how it felt to always be second, how it felt to be treated like drama for asking to be included. But then I'd remember there was nothing to explain. She knew what she did. She just didn't think it was wrong. Eleanor nodded, like she understood in a way that didn't require words. She said it was a hard thing to accept. I told her I kept waiting to feel guilty, because people love to say you should forgive family no matter what. Blood is thicker than water. Family is family. Eleanor snorted softly at that and said she'd never believed it. She told me, in that calm voice she used when she was about to drop a truth, that in her career, she'd helped people find legal recognition for the families they built, not the ones they were born into. "The law recognizes what the heart already knows," she said. At the time, I didn't understand what she was hinting at. She didn't push. She just patted my hand and asked if I'd ever grown tomatoes. But the idea stayed in me like a seed. 2 years after that first Thanksgiving, Marcus asked me to dinner at Harborview Grill, the same restaurant where everything started. When I slid into the booth, I laughed and said it felt circular. He smiled and said that was the point. He was nervous. I could tell by the way he adjusted his napkin, the way he kept taking small sips of water, the way his knee bounced under the table. Halfway through dinner, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Tori," he said, and his voice was steady, but his eyes were soft. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months. I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you every single day." My heart stopped, not because I didn't want it, but because part of me still associated love with conditions and loss. Marcus said he knew my family hurt me. He said he knew I was scared of people who were supposed to love you letting you down. He squeezed my hand and said, "But I'm not going anywhere." Then he pulled out a small velvet box. "Elena," he said, "will you marry me?" I couldn't breathe. My eyes burned. I saw my future in a flash. Not the old future I'd always feared, where I stayed small and unchosen, but a new one where someone looked at me and didn't flinch. I whispered, "Yes." The restaurant erupted in applause. And then I looked over and saw Richard and Eleanor in a corner booth, champagne already poured, beaming like they'd known all along. Marcus laughed and said his mom couldn't resist. Eleanor lifted her glass to me from across the room, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as profound relief. I wasn't going to have to do life alone. Wedding planning began immediately, and it was joyful in a way I'd never let myself imagine. Venue tours, cake tastings, flower samples, guest lists. But one question haunted me. The invitations needed a line for parents of the bride. 4 nights in a row, I stared at that blank space like it was a judgment. Robert and Linda Thatcher hadn't spoken to me in over 2 years. No birthday call, No check-in, no "Are you alive?" I couldn't put their names on my wedding invitation like they'd earned a place in my life. I couldn't pretend for appearances. I'd spent too long pretending. One evening, I was pacing in the Morrison living room, restless and tight-chested, when Eleanor found me. She didn't ask what was wrong in a way that demanded I perform. She just sat down and patted the cushion beside her. I sat, and the words tumbled out. The invitation line, the shame, the fear of what people would say, the old guilt that still whispered I was being cruel by not including them. Eleanor listened, then said quietly, "Do you remember when I told you the law recognizes the families we build?" I nodded. She said two words that made my breath catch: adult adoption. She explained it with the calm certainty of someone who knew both the legal process and the emotional truth underneath it. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a gesture. It created a legal parent-to-child relationship. New birth certificate, next of kin status, everything. I stared at her like she just offered me oxygen. My voice cracked when I asked if that was real. She smiled and said it was very real. Then I looked at this woman who had walked up to a crying stranger on Thanksgiving and decided to make room, who had fed me and listened to me and held my hand and called me sweetheart, without making it feel like pity. And I heard myself say the question I'd been scared to ask for months. "Eleanor," I whispered, "would you and Richard consider—" She didn't let me finish. She pulled me into her arms, so quickly it made me gasp. "We've considered you our daughter since the first Thanksgiving," she whispered into my hair. "We were waiting for you to be ready." I started to cry. Not pretty tears, not controlled ones. The kind that come from old hunger finally being fed. Richard walked in, saw me, didn't ask questions. He just sat down beside us and put a hand on my back like I was his too. The adoption process took months. Paperwork, forms, signatures, court schedules. But it didn't feel like bureaucracy. It felt like building something permanent. Eleanor guided me through everything, not in a showy way, but in the steady way she did all things. There were nights we sat at her dining table with stacks of papers and pens, and she explained what each document meant. Richard would bring tea and snacks and act like this was the most normal thing in the world, as if people became family all the time, because in their home they did. The day we went to court, I wore a simple dress and kept checking my reflection in the mirror like I was afraid I looked like an imposter. Marcus squeezed my hand in the car, quiet and present. Richard drove, carefully, both hands on the wheel like the day deserved respect. Eleanor sat in the back seat with me and told me a story about her first courtroom case. Something light, like she knew I needed my nervous system to stay inside my body. In the courthouse hallway, everything smelled like paper and floor polish. The lights were too bright. My stomach flipped. I kept expecting someone to stop us and say we didn't belong there, that this wasn't allowed, that you couldn't legally claim love. But no one did. In the courtroom, the judge asked questions in a formal tone. Did we understand what adult adoption meant? Did we consent? Were we doing this willingly? Eleanor answered clearly. Richard's voice cracked when he said yes, and he cleared his throat and said it again, stronger. When it was my turn, my mouth went dry. I said yes. I said it like a promise. The judge looked down at the paperwork, then up at me, and said something simple about family being a responsibility and a privilege. Then the judge signed the order. I didn't expect a signature to feel like anything, but it did. Something inside me settled like a door closing behind me, not trapping me but protecting me. I wasn't floating on the edge of a family anymore. I had legal parents. I had a new last name if I wanted it. I had a place in the world that could not be argued away by someone calling me dramatic. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor hugged me and whispered, "My daughter." Richard hugged me too, awkward at first and then tight, and said, "Proud of you, kid." I sat in the car afterward, holding the court order in my lap, and stared at my own name on the document like it was proof that I was allowed to be chosen. We sent out wedding invitations with a line printed clearly, "Parents of the bride, Richard and Eleanor Morrison." The blank space that had haunted me was filled, and it felt right in a way that made me breathe easier. I should have known my biological family would find out. Families like mine don't stay gone out of respect. They stay gone when it's convenient, and they return when they want something. 3 months before the wedding, my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, the first message from her in nearly 3 years. Seeing her name on my screen felt like stepping on a loose stair. The message was short and smug, as if she was still in control. She'd heard I was getting married. No congratulations. No apology. Just the implication that I'd done something she was entitled to know about. I stared at it for a long time, then blocked her. My hands shook, but my decision didn't. A week later, my mother called 5 times in one day. I let every call go to voicemail. She texted, demanding to know why she hadn't been told, as if silence was something that happened to her, not something she chose. I deleted the texts. I wasn't angry. Anger had burned out years earlier. What I felt was a kind of exhaustion, like my body refused to carry their confusion anymore. Marcus found me sitting on the couch, staring at my phone with my jaw clenched. He didn't demand to see the messages. He didn't start strategizing without my permission. He just sat down beside me and asked, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Nothing. I don't owe them anything." He nodded. "Okay," he said. "Then we do nothing." But we both knew doing nothing would not stop them from trying. It just meant I wasn't volunteering myself for the fight. My mother showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working from home. I opened the door without checking, because a part of me still didn't expect my own mother to be the one barging in like an intruder. She stood there in my hallway, older than I remembered, grayer, more tired, but with the same disappointed expression I'd spent my childhood trying to erase. "Tori," she said, like my name was a complaint. Before I could answer, she pushed past me into my apartment without being invited, looking around like she was inspecting something she owned. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Getting married without telling your own mother?" I stood by the door, my heart pounding, and said, "We haven't spoken in 3 years." She snapped, "And whose fault is that?" I closed the door slowly and counted to 5, because I knew if I let my voice rise, she would call it drama. "Yours," I said. "It was your fault. You told me not to come home. And after that, you never called. Not once." She waved her hand like she was brushing away dust. "That was one Thanksgiving," she said. "You can't still be upset about that." "I'm not upset," I said, and I realized it was true. "I've moved on." Her eyes landed on the framed photos on my bookshelf. Me and Marcus at the beach. Me and Eleanor in the kitchen making pie. The Morrison family at Christmas, with me in the center. Her face twisted. "Who are these people?" she demanded. "My family," I said. She stepped closer, her jaw tight. "I am your family." I met her gaze evenly. "You were," I said. "You chose not to be." Her mouth opened like she couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. Then she said the thing she came for. "I want an invitation to the wedding." "No," I said. One word. Clean. Simple. Her eyes widened. "Excuse me." I walked to the door and opened it. My heart was still pounding, but my hands were steady. "You don't get to erase me and then demand a seat at my table," I said. She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. Then she left, stiff with humiliation. And when the door closed, I leaned against it and breathed until my body stopped shaking. Not because I regretted it, but because my nervous system still remembered what it felt like to defy her. The wedding day dawned golden and perfect. June in Napa Valley. Sunlight spilling over rolling hills, an endless rows of grapevines like the world was blessing us. We chose an outdoor ceremony and a reception in a stone barn decorated with white roses and greenery. In the bridal suite, Eleanor adjusted my veil in the mirror with hands so gentle it made my throat ache. "You look beautiful," she said softly. I looked at my reflection and saw someone calmer than the girl who'd cried alone in Harborview Grill. That girl hadn't believed she deserved love. This woman knew better. On the vanity sat the wedding program, and I picked it up and read the line that still felt miraculous. "Parents of the bride, Richard and Eleanor Morrison." Underneath, smaller, the phrase we'd chosen carefully, "the family who chose her." Eleanor noticed me looking. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "About marrying Marcus?" I shook my head. "No." I set the program down. "About what might happen," I admitted. After my mother showed up at my apartment, I'd hired security quietly. Not because I wanted drama, but because I wanted peace. Eleanor put her hands on my shoulders and said, "Whatever happens today, you have a family who chose you. We will always choose you." I hugged her, and the words came out before I could overthink them. "I love you, Mom." It was the first time I'd called her that. The word felt natural, like it had been waiting in my throat for years. Eleanor's eyes glistened. I love you too, she whispered. My daughter. Outside the window, I could see guests arriving. Marcus was already at the altar, looking nervous and handsome, adjusting his suit jacket like he was trying to keep his hands from shaking. The music started. It was time. The ceremony was everything I dreamed. Richard walked me down the aisle, steady and proud. I gripped his arm and felt safe. Marcus's eyes filled with tears when he saw me, and I felt my chest loosen like some old knot finally untied. We said vows we wrote ourselves, words that made guests cry and made me laugh in the middle of my own promise because I was overwhelmed by joy. When Marcus slipped the ring onto my finger, and we were pronounced husband and wife, something clicked into place like the last piece of a lifelong puzzle. The reception began in a blur of light and music and hugs and clinking glasses. I danced with Marcus under warm string lights. I laughed with Sarah and Daniel. I kissed Emma's forehead when she told me I looked like a princess. I watched Richard try to hide tears and fail. I watched Eleanor hold my hands and squeeze them like she was reminding me I wasn't alone. For a while, I let myself forget the edge of dread I'd been carrying. Then, a security guard approached discreetly and said, Mrs. Morrison, there are 2 people at the entrance. They claim to be your parents. My stomach didn't drop the way it used to. It tightened. Yes, but my mind stayed clear. Marcus stepped closer, his expression hardening. I'll handle it, he said. I shook my head. No, I said. This is my moment. I'll handle it. I could have had them removed. I could have avoided it, but something in me wanted them to see. Let them see what they lost. Let them see the family who stepped up when they stepped away. Let them witness the life I built without them. I told the guard to let them in, but not to seat them with family. Put them in the back. A few minutes later, I saw them standing uncertainly at the edge of the reception. Linda and Robert Thatcher. My mother looked rigid, scanning the room like she was searching for her rightful place. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Shoulders slumped, hands stuffed into his pockets like he wanted to disappear. They had not spoken to me in years, yet they stood in my wedding reception as if showing up was enough to erase everything. The MC stepped up to the microphone. The music softened. He asked for everyone's attention. I watched my parents from across the room. Linda straightened, preparing herself, ready to accept recognition she believed was hers by default. The MC said, Before we continue the celebration, I'd like to introduce some very special people. Please join me in welcoming the parents of the bride. Linda's chin lifted. Then the MC announced clearly and joyfully, Richard and Eleanor Morrison. The room erupted in applause. Richard and Eleanor stood from the head table, beaming, waving, receiving cheers like they deserved. People whistled, glasses clinked. The photographer snapped photos. Across the room, my mother's face went white. I watched the confusion hit first, then disbelief. Then the moment understanding dropped over her like cold water. Richard and Eleanor were not like my parents. They were my parents, in every way that mattered. My mother grabbed my father's arm and whispered something I couldn't hear, her mouth moving fast, frantic. My father's eyes widened. He looked stunned, like he'd been dragged into the truth and couldn't look away. Linda pushed through the crowd before I could stop her. She reached me as the applause died down, her face flushed, her eyes wild with humiliation. My father trailed behind her, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. What is going on? My mother hissed. Who are those people? I kept my voice calm. Calm was power. My legal parents, I said. I was adopted. She blinked. You what? She staggered back half a step. You can't just replace us. I didn't replace you, I said evenly. You abandoned me first. Her mouth opened. We never abandoned you, she snapped. And the lie was so practiced it almost sounded like truth. I looked at her and said, You told me not to come home. You chose Victoria every time for 27 years. And after that Thanksgiving, you went silent for 3 more. Guests nearby had noticed the confrontation. Conversations faded. Heads turned. My mother tried to argue about fairness, about family, about loyalty. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Fair, I said softly. I spent my whole life trying to earn a place in your family. You know what I got? A Thanksgiving dinner alone. An Instagram photo with no empty chair. 3 years where you pretended I didn't exist. My mother's eyes darted around, suddenly aware of the audience, her cheeks burning red. I'm still your mother, she said, voice cracking with anger more than grief. Not legally, I said, and I held up my left hand, my wedding ring catching the warm reception lights. Not emotionally. Not anymore. The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like truth settling. My mother's lips trembled. This is humiliating, she hissed. I looked at her and said, then leave. My voice wasn't cruel. It was final. And then, for the first time in my entire life, my father spoke when it mattered. Tori, he said, and my stomach clenched at the sound of my name in his mouth. His voice was rough, broken. I'm sorry. I turned to look at him. Really look. Robert Thatcher had aged more than 5 years should account for. His hair was grayer, his shoulders slumped, his eyes were wet with tears. I had never seen my father cry. Not once. I'm sorry, he said again. I should have done better. Something cracked inside my chest, not into healing, but into recognition. An old wound being named. Too late. I felt Marcus move to my side, a steady presence. I said gently but firmly, I know you're sorry, Dad, but sorry doesn't undo the years you stood by and watched. Sorry doesn't give me back my childhood. Sorry doesn't make this okay. My father nodded and wiped his face. I know, he whispered. I was a coward. I always was. I knew how your mother treated you, how Victoria treated you, and I just let it happen. My mother grabbed his arm, furious. Robert, what are you doing? He shook her off, eyes still on me, and whispered, You were my little girl, and I let you feel like you didn't matter. Eleanor appeared at my shoulder and placed a hand on my arm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her touch was a reminder I wasn't alone. My mother stared at Eleanor with naked hostility. You, she spat. The one who stole my daughter. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Calm. Controlled. I didn't steal anything, Mrs. Thatcher, she said. My mother's jaw worked like she wanted to spit more venom, but couldn't find the right words. Richard stepped forward then, positioning himself beside Eleanor like a shield. Richard wasn't a confrontational man, not by nature. In the years I'd known him, I'd never heard him raise his voice. But when he spoke now, there was steel in it that silenced the entire space around us. I think it's time for you folks to leave, he said. My mother snapped. Who are you to tell us? I'm her mother. Richard's voice carried, calm and certain. I'm her father, he said. Legally, and in every way that matters. My mother's face twisted. You stole our daughter. Richard shook his head. No, ma'am, he said. We didn't steal anything. You gave her away. We just picked up what you threw out. My mother flinched like she'd been slapped. Richard continued, voice steady, each word placed carefully. 5 years ago, this young woman was sitting alone in a restaurant on Thanksgiving because her own family told her she wasn't welcome. My wife invited her to our table. We fed her. We talked to her. We treated her like a human being. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but it carried anyway in the quiet. Do you know what she told us that night? She said she couldn't remember the last time she felt like she mattered. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Richard turned slightly, as if addressing not just them, but the universe. This is my daughter's wedding day, he said. The happiest day of her life. And I won't let anyone ruin it. He nodded to the security guards nearby. As they approached, I lifted my hand. Wait, I said. Everything froze. For a second, my mother's eyes flickered with hope, like she thought I was about to change my mind. I walked toward my biological parents and stopped an arm's length away. Mom, I said. Dad. The words still felt strange in my mouth. I need you to understand something. My mother lifted her chin. What? I took a breath and said, I don't hate you. Her expression shifted, confusion, then suspicion, like she didn't understand words that weren't an attack. I don't hate you, I repeated. I've made peace with who you are. You're not villains. You're just people who couldn't love me the way I needed to be loved. People who chose comfort over fairness. People who let one daughter become invisible so the other could shine. My father cried silently. My mother's face became a mask. But I've also made peace with who I am, I continued. And who I am is someone who deserves to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as an afterthought. Chosen first. I gestured to the Morrisons behind me, the family standing like a wall of love. You didn't choose me, I said. They did, and I choose them. My mother opened her mouth to speak. I didn't let her. I'm not erasing you from my history, I said. I'm just not giving you a seat at my table anymore. And that's not revenge. That's the natural consequence of your choices. I nodded to security. Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Dad. They were escorted out. The applause that followed wasn't for drama. It was for the boundary. It was for the truth. It was for a daughter who stopped shrinking. After they were gone, my body shook for a few minutes, like it finally released adrenaline it had been hoarding for years. Marcus held my hands and looked into my eyes and said, "You okay?" I nodded. Because I was. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it was done. Eleanor hugged me, so tight I could feel her heartbeat. Richard kissed the top of my head like he'd done it 100 times. Then the music rose again, and the night returned to joy. We danced, we laughed, we cut the cake while everyone cheered. Marcus twirled me until I was dizzy. And for hours, I let myself be happy without scanning the edges for danger. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages from cousins I hadn't heard from in years and aunts and uncles whose names I still associated with obligatory holiday photos. They said I was cruel. They said family is family. They said I'd broken my father's heart. The same people who never showed up for me now had plenty to say about my boundaries. I deleted the messages without responding. The silence I gave them wasn't punishment. It was protection. Then a text came from someone unexpected. My Aunt Patricia, my father's younger sister. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She said she'd heard what happened, and she wanted me to know she was proud of me. She said she always knew Linda and Victoria treated me wrong. She said she tried to speak up once, and my mother stopped talking to her for a year. "You deserved better," she wrote. "You always did." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Then I typed back a simple "thank you," because anything more would have opened a floodgate I didn't want to drown in on my honeymoon. My mother posted a long, dramatic status online about ungrateful children and loyalty in modern families. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That evening, I blocked every phone number and social media account connected to the Thatcher side of my family. Not out of anger. Out of peace. Marcus found me on the balcony of our honeymoon suite, looking out over the vineyard glowing gold in the sunset. "You okay?" he asked. I leaned into him and said, "Yeah, I really am." For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of people who didn't want to carry me. I was finally free. 2 weeks after the wedding, a handwritten letter arrived at our new address. The return address said Victoria Thatcher Collins. My sister's handwriting was exactly like I remembered. Perfect, loopy, like she'd practiced being charming. I almost threw it away unopened, but something made me sit down at the kitchen table and read it. The letter was full of the same language my family had always used to keep me small. Mom was devastated. Dad hadn't been the same. They were trying to keep the peace. I was difficult. I asked too many questions. I brought up old hurts. It was exhausting. She wrote that maybe when I had kids, I would understand why Mom made the choices she made. She wrote, "They still loved me, even if I decided they weren't good enough for me." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. Not to keep it as a treasure. To contain it, like you contain something that could poison you if you held it too long. Marcus came home and found me at the kitchen table. "What's that?" he asked. "A letter from Victoria," I said. He asked what she said. I told him. Nothing new. He watched my face and asked if it bothered me that she didn't understand. I thought about it honestly. "No," I said finally. "It's not my job to make her understand." It never was. Saying it out loud felt like unclenching a fist I didn't know I was holding. A year after the wedding, life had settled into something beautiful. Marcus and I bought a house outside Boston, a little Cape Cod with a backyard big enough to imagine a future in. It was close enough to Brookline for Sunday dinners, far enough that it felt like our own space. I stopped freelancing and became an art director at a design agency. The first day I walked into my own office, I sat at the desk and felt proud in a way that didn't require anyone else's approval. Marcus was thriving at his architecture firm. We were building a life together, literally and figuratively, with weekends that didn't involve walking on eggshells and holidays that didn't require me to shrink. And then, I got pregnant. The day the test turned positive, I sat on the bathroom floor and laughed and cried at the same time. Marcus knocked on the door and asked if I was okay. And I came out, holding the test like it was the most fragile thing in the world. His face changed instantly. Shock, joy, disbelief. And then he pulled me into his arms, so tight I squeaked. When we told Eleanor and Richard, Eleanor cried immediately, hands flying to her mouth like she couldn't contain the emotion. Richard tried to act composed, blinking fast, then sniffed and said something about allergies, and everyone laughed because no one believed him. Daniel's kids started arguing about who would be the baby's favorite cousin before we even finished dessert. One Sunday afternoon, Eleanor and I set up the nursery. We painted the walls a soft sage green, and the room smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Richard built a rocking chair by hand, sanding the wood until it was smooth, humming quietly like he was building love into the grain. Marcus assembled the crib with the seriousness of someone assembling a spaceship. Eleanor held up 2 different mobiles and asked which one I liked. I told her I'd been thinking about names. If it was a girl, I wanted Emily. Emily Grace Morrison. Eleanor's eyes filled. "That's beautiful," she whispered. I smiled and told her the Morrison part was non-negotiable. "I want her to have the name of the family that chose her mother," I said. Eleanor set the mobiles down and hugged me. "You know," she said, "when I saw you sitting alone in that restaurant, I had no idea we'd end up here. I just saw someone who needed kindness." I told her honestly that she saved my life that night. She pulled back, held my shoulders, and looked directly into my eyes. "No, sweetheart," she said. "You saved yourself. We just showed you it was possible." That sentence stayed with me through my pregnancy, through every moment of fear and joy, through every wave of hormones and every late-night worry. You saved yourself. It made me feel powerful in a way I'd never been allowed to feel as a child. When Emily was born, tiny and perfect, I held her against my chest and whispered promises I hadn't known I needed to make until I had her in my arms. I whispered that she would never have to earn my love. She would never have to make herself small to be safe. She would never have to wonder if she mattered. Marcus sat beside me and cried silently, wiping his cheeks with the heel of his hand. Eleanor hovered like she didn't want to overwhelm me, but also couldn't bear to be far away. And Richard stood behind her with his hands folded, eyes shining, looking at Emily like she was a miracle he'd been waiting for his whole life. 5 years to the day after I sat alone in Harborview Grill, I sat at the head of a very different table. The Morrison house was chaos, the best kind. Emily, 6 months old now, was being passed from lap to lap like a tiny, drooling treasure. Daniel's kids played some complicated card game in the corner, arguing over rules they made up as they went. Sarah and Marcus debated the correct way to carve turkey. Richard tried to sneak extra pie when he thought Eleanor wasn't looking. She was, and she swatted his hand with a dish towel while laughing. The whole room smelled like roasted turkey and butter and cinnamon and warm bread, and it felt like safety made visible. Eleanor clapped her hands and said, "We need a toast before we eat." Then she looked at me. "Tori," she said, "would you do the honors?" I stood with Emily in my arms and looked around the table. At the family I'd found, the family that had found me. I felt Marcus's hand squeeze my knee under the table. I took a breath and said, 5 years ago tonight, I was sitting alone in a restaurant, wondering if I'd ever belong anywhere. I thought I was unlovable. I thought there was something wrong with me, that I was too much, too difficult, too dramatic. Richard's eyes went wet. Eleanor was already crying. Then a stranger named Eleanor Morrison came up to my table and said, "No one should eat alone on Thanksgiving." And everything changed. I raised my glass and said, "To family. Not the one we're born into, but the one we build. The one we choose. The one that chooses us back." Everyone echoed it. Glasses clinked. Emily gurgled like she approved. Richard finally got his extra piece of pie and tried to pretend he hadn't wanted it all night. I sat back down and looked around at these people, my people, and felt something I'd spent my whole childhood chasing. I belonged. Completely. Unconditionally. For the first time in my life, I was home. After dinner, Marcus and I sat on the back porch with Emily asleep between us and her carrier. The November air was cold, but we were bundled in blankets, watching stars appear one by one. Marcus asked quietly if I ever thought about my biological parents. Sometimes, I admitted, in the middle of the night mostly. I'll wonder how they're doing, if they've changed, if they ever understood what they lost. Marcus asked if I thought they had. I shook my head. "People rarely do," I said. "Not in the ways that matter." He asked if that made me sad. I looked at Emily's tiny fist curled near her cheek, her chest rising and falling peacefully, and I realized my answer had changed. "It used to," I said, "but not anymore. I spent so many years being sad about a family that didn't want me. I don't have room for that anymore. My life is too full." What changed wasn't them. It was me. I stopped waiting for them to love me the way I needed. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into their version of who I should be. I started building something new with people who showed up again and again, even when I didn't know how to accept it. Setting boundaries isn't revenge. It's survival. It's choosing yourself when no one else will. Family isn't blood if blood demands you bleed quietly. Family is the people who show up, the people who see you crying alone at a restaurant table and invite you to join them. The people who open their Sunday dinners and their hearts and their lives to you until you realize you were never too much. You were just in the wrong place, begging the wrong people for the wrong kind of love. This journey taught me so much about what family truly means. I want to hear from you. What does family mean to you? Have you ever had to choose yourself over the family you were born into? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really interested to hear your stories.